My dear brothers and sisters in Islam, following up from last week, we discussed the nature of the message of our beloved Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam, being a message of reform, reformation of doctrine, as well as social practice and behavior. It's a message that is transformative in nature. And so what I'd like to share with you today are a few stories of transformation, or conversion stories, if you will. The first four people to embrace Islam, or to convert or transform their life, as many of you know, the first was Khadija radiallahu anha. We've talked about her to some extent, along with Ali, Zayd, and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhum. These were the first to enter into Islam, to answer the invitation of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And those four, three of them, of course, the wife of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, supporting the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam at home, and that was ever so important, to have that support at home. However, Ali was very young at the time. He was a young boy, and Zayd had no real position in his community. He had not built any influence among his peers. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, however, was very different in this regard. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq was well respected. He was a man of the community. He was well-mannered and likable. He had a pleasant personality. And he was also very knowledgeable. In general, but in particular, he was very well educated to the lineage of the Arab. And as tribalism goes, that's quite important. And so that type of knowledge, it puts you in a position of authority, much like what we value today when we meet doctors. We value health and medicine, and therefore a medical doctor has a certain level of influence, or a specialist of some type. And this was the case for Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. And actually people would seek his counsel on various different communal matters or business. He was also a very savvy businessman. He was what we would call an influencer, social influencer. And believe it or not, but Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, he kind of led the charge for the outreach efforts of Islam in the initial stages. Many people embraced Islam through his own efforts. And the first of those that answered his invitation was Khalid ibn Sa'id ibn al-As, another one of the great companions that embraced Islam very early. Khalid ibn Sa'id, he, radiallahu anhum ajma'in, one night he saw a terrible dream. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, by the way, was known to interpret dreams. So people would come to him when they saw something in their dreams and ask what it meant. And so Khalid, that night, he saw that he was standing on the edge of a fire pit. Looking out at this pit of fire, he noted that there was no end in sight to it. And standing there looking at it, standing almost over it, his father came and tried to shove him into the fire. And all of a sudden he felt hands securely grasping his waist and holding him up from falling in. And when he looked down to see who it was Al-Amin, our beloved Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam. It was Muhammad as he knew him. And so Khalid, he went to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, and he wanted his dream to be interpreted. And he told him what happened. He said, look, this is what I saw, this enormous pit of fire, and I almost was shoved in by my very own father. And then I saw Muhammad grasping my waist, holding me with both hands and keeping me from falling in. And Abu Bakr as-Siddiq immediately began to congratulate Khalid. Words of joy and celebration. And he said that the man saving you in your dream is a prophet of Allah. And if you want to be saved from hell, because essentially that's what it was. If you want to be saved from hell, you would have to follow him in this life. Meaning, you would have to turn away from the path of your fathers, the idolaters of Quraysh. You would have to follow the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so Khalid, he went to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam immediately after receiving that interpretation of his dream. And he spoke to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, recounting exactly what he saw. And so the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam invited him to Islam. He invited him to embrace Islam and find salvation. And so that's exactly what he did. Khalid, he embraced Islam. And then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam instructed him to keep it a secret, as he would do for a number of companions very early on in the mission. Tell them to keep it secret, even from their own parents. Khalid actually ended up letting his father know what had happened. And the story of Khalid, we're going to come back to it when we have to take a trip to Africa. Because Khalid was abused at that point by his father. He was punished because he embraced Islam. And he was locked away for several days without food or drink, in hopes that he would relinquish that newfound faith. But he stood his ground, and eventually he was given relief. After the story of Khalid, or the conversion of Khalid, there was another man, Umayyad businessman. He was on his way home from Syria, traversing the trade routes. And while he was camped out in the desert in the middle of the night, he heard a voice crying out. And the voice said, "Sleeper, awake. For verily Ahmed has come forth in Mecca." And the businessman here, he didn't understand exactly what those words meant. Sleeper, awake, for Ahmed has come forth in Mecca. Something about them penetrated his heart and weighed heavily on his mind. And so on the way home, he ran into Talha, who was returning from Basra. And while he was there, he passed by a monk. And we know that's where the monks were located, around that region. And the monk asked him if the prophet Ahmed had appeared in the land, in his land. And so Talha, he asked, "Who is this Ahmed?" And the monk, he says, "It's the son of Abdullah ibn Abdul Muttalib." So essentially, the businessman here, who happens to be none other than Uthman ibn Affan, and Talha are together. And they're now swapping stories. Well, this is what I heard out in the desert. I heard about Ahmed coming forth in Mecca, and I have no idea who Ahmed is. And Talha, he says, "Well, I'm coming home from this monk, and he's asking about Ahmed, and he says the son of Abdullah ibn Abdul Muttalib, who's supposed to be the prophet of our people." And so they both head straight for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they both talk to him, and they essentially recount for them the series of events that occurred, which led to them embracing Islam, led to them converting to the faith. And the middleman was Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. Talha was a cousin of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, and Talha suggested that they go to Abu Bakr to find out who is this Ahmed being referred to by the monk, and that's there in the dream. And so Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, he says, "Well, I know exactly that's Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam." And he led them to their own salvation. Also from the efforts of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq was Abdu Amr ibn Auf. Abdu Amr ibn Auf. That means the slave of Amr. And we know that's problematic in our faith because we're only slaves to Allah. We're not enslaved in that manner to the creation. And actually, Abdu Amr, he became known as Abdurrahman ibn Auf, one of the 10 guaranteed paradise while alive. Also, Abu Ubaid ibn al-Jarrah from Bani al-Harith. They were invited to Islam by Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, and they accepted that invitation and converted. Another great conversion story is that of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, radiyallahu anhu. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he was a shepherd, and he was herding the sheep of one of the Meccan tribesmen. He was out there, and the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, they came out there, they're passing by, and they saw Abdullah ibn Mas'ud with the herd of sheep, and they asked him if they had any milk that they could drink. They're passing by. You know, not everything's for sale. Not everything's for sale. Some things are given as gifts and a way to honor others. And that was part of the tradition at the time. Some of that tradition continues to this very day. In some parts of Arabia, it's considered a social shame to sell camel's milk. But it's something that you gift to visitors and guests. And so Abdullah, he said, look, these aren't my sheep. I have no authority to give or to share or anything. And so the Prophet ﷺ asked for a very particular type of sheep. He says, if you have one of those in your herd or your flock here, bring it here. And he did. He brought it, and the Prophet ﷺ put his hand on the udder and began to pray. And Abdullah noted that the udder began to fill with milk. And so the Prophet ﷺ standing there, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq brought a rock that was carved into the shape of a bowl, and the Prophet ﷺ began to milk that sheep to fill that bowl, and all three of them drank from that milk. And then the Prophet ﷺ put his hand on the udder and said for it to dry, and so it shrunk and dried back out. The Prophet ﷺ shared some words of the Quran with Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and later on he would become one of the great imams of the Quran from the companions. There were numerous people from the house of the Prophet ﷺ that embraced faith as well during that time, the early days of Islam. This is while it's still kind of in its secretive stages. Ja'far and Zubayr, Abdullah ibn Jahsh, his brother Ubaydullah, Abu Salama, Sa'id, or I should say Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, and his brother Umair. All of those embraced Islam. The Prophet ﷺ actually invited his entire clan, Bani Abdul Muttalib, for dinner one night. That's right. He would use food as a tactic or a strategy. He would offer a dinner, prepared a big dinner for them. It was not enough to feed everyone, but the Prophet ﷺ is blessed, and his efforts have barakah from Allah. And so whatever little bit of food that he offered, it was noted that the meat and the milk that he offered for those guests, it lasted, and it almost seemed as if they could not eat it all. And it took a couple of these dinners actually to take effect. The first one was interrupted by Abu Lahab. Before the Prophet ﷺ could speak to his family members, he was interrupted, and basically he said to them, you are all being tricked by a sorcerer. And they all left before the Prophet ﷺ could talk. And then he invited them again, and they came back, and he fed them, and he began to speak to them and share the message of Islam with them, and that resulted in some of his aunts accepting Islam, Safiya and al-Fadl. al-Fadl was the second woman to embrace Islam. And the Quraysh, the idolaters, I should say, all the while are watching the growth of this new faith. And this faith, Islam, spoke out against false gods. And it also called for social reformation. Because of that, the idolaters needed to act. They needed to act immediately because it was catching on. It wasn't like the previous movements that we discussed last week, the previous reform movements, but now it was starting to catch on, and it was moving rapidly through the inner circle of the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam. So the first thing they tried to do was persuade Abu Talib to check his nephew. Look, put your nephew in check right now. He's disrupting our community and our social order, vilifying our idols, challenging the status quo. Abu Talib, he didn't do anything about it initially. He gave them an answer just to please them, for them to leave, but nothing came of it. And so they went back again. Abu Talib, what are you doing? This is wrong. You have to step in. And if you don't step in this time, we will step in and see to it. So Abu Talib, he went to the Prophet ﷺ and he told them what had happened. And he said, look, man, save me and save yourself from a calamity here with our people. Stop doing what you're doing. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, listen, if they were to fill my hands with everything in this world, the sun and the moon and the stars and everything you could imagine, I will not stop. I will not stop preaching the truth and conveying the message of Allah. And the Prophet ﷺ turned away and began to walk from his uncle, who called him back and said to do what he needed to do. The Prophet ﷺ was ready to endure whatever would come his way for the sake of Allah. And the Quraysh, they would have to deal with that. But in the meantime, what's the plan? Because they revered tribal law, they couldn't physically persuade anyone of influence. If you belonged to a good clan, you were safe. But if you belonged to a weak one, few in number or without any status, then you were subject to physical harm and abuse. You were persecuted for your beliefs. And they also devised the smear campaign to divert the pilgrims from the Prophet ﷺ. During this time, the pilgrimage was just months away, and they were extremely worried that if they hadn't a plan in place, the pilgrims would come in and they would be introduced to the Prophet's preaching. And he was very eloquent. He was likable. He was handsome. He was a leader. He could captivate an audience. And so simply just denying him as being the Prophet wasn't enough, but they needed to smear his character. And so they suggested many things among themselves. Many things, many campaigns were suggested, one of them being a sorcerer. And the leader at that time, he rejected all of those campaigns, all the suggestions. But he came back to one, and that was the sorcerer. And while they knew that the Prophet ﷺ was not an actual sorcerer, he was not a magician, he was nothing of that sort, there was something in common with him and the sorcerer. And that was that he was able to separate families. And that's what they considered a sorcerer to do with their magic, was to separate between the husband and the wife and between blood relatives. And they saw this happening with the Prophet ﷺ, that his words were dividing families and were now wreaking havoc on their tribe. And so they decided to use that. That was going to be the campaign. And so what they did was they sent riders out onto all of the roadways that led to Mecca in order to station people there. While the pilgrims came in, they would stop them and they would warn them of a sorcerer that was among them, and that they should stay away and not listen. The problem was they were unable, while it was very effective, to reach everybody in time. So the plan was not quite foolproof. And there were certain areas that they couldn't cover. And from those areas was a westward village, if you will, towards the Red Sea, just north of Mecca. It was the land of Bani al-Ghifar. Bani al-Ghifar. And this was where Abu Dharr al-Ghifari resided. And that tribe was known to be highwaymen. That was their occupation. They were robbers. Because they lived on the route, the trade route from Mecca on up to northward. This is a great companion, Abu Dharr al-Ghifari. This is how he started his life. This is the real transformation of Islam, by the way. He was there with his tribe. They were highwaymen, and they would hold up those caravans. And they would take from them, they would rob them on the way to Syria, or they would get an insurance payment from them, something of that nature. And so Abu Dharr, there was one quality about him that distinguished him from many of the idolaters, and that was he only believed in Allah. He believed in one God. That's something, right? You're a thief, a highwayman, but you have this strong belief that there's only one God. You should not worship idols. That's the way society was. And guess what? That's the way society is today. We don't change much as human beings. You can have this resolute belief in Allah, yet you act in a manner that just seems almost contradictory to it. Abu Dharr, he heard the news of Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, our prophet. There was a prophet that had come, and so he sent his brother to go to Mecca to meet the prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, talk to him, learn what he could learn, and come back to report his findings. And he did. His brother went off. He went to Mecca, met with the prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, came back to Abu Dharr. Abu Dharr is like, what's up with this guy in Mecca? He starts to say, look, I found the man there. He enjoins good. He forbids evil. Abu Dharr is like, look, that's just not enough for me. I need more information than that. What do you have? He's got nothing. The call is very basic. The invitation is very basic. So Abu Dharr, he has to go himself to be convinced. He has to see it for himself. And so he goes, but he goes quietly. He doesn't talk about it. He doesn't mention who he's looking for. And he ends up in the masjid there, in the sanctuary of Mecca. And he's living off of Zamzam water. I guess the trade route wasn't traveled that time. Living off of Zamzam water. And eventually, he comes in contact with Ali ibn Abi Talib, radiallahu anhu. Ali, he passes by, says, looks like you're a stranger from out of town. He's like, yeah, I'm from out of town. And so Ali, he took him to his house, as a guest. And that exchange concluded. The next day, the same thing happened. Ali passed by Abu Dharr. He said, look, have you not found a place? Have you not found your home? And he's like, no. He says, well, why are you here? What brought you to our city? And Abu Dharr, he says to Ali, listen, I'll tell you if you can keep a secret. Ali says, sure, I'll keep a secret. And so Abu Dharr, he divulges that secret, the mission. He's looking for a prophet. He's looking for the prophet of Arabia. And so Ali, of course, who's Muslim, he says, follow me. I'm going to him right now. Stay behind me some, because it's tricky right now. And he says to him, look, if you see me step aside to adjust my sandals, then you'll know that's a warning. You need to split. I know these people. So they went, and he led them to the place where the Prophet ﷺ was, and Abu Dharr went inside and sat with the Prophet ﷺ. He said, look, I need you to tell me about this faith. Tell me about what it is that you're preaching. What it is you're inviting others to. And so the Prophet ﷺ began to teach him about Islam. In some narrations, the Prophet ﷺ recited the Quran to Abu Dharr. And upon hearing that, he embraced the faith. He embraced Islam. And eventually, he would retire from being a highwayman to being a great leader, an influencer to his community. So, the Prophet ﷺ, after having invited Abu Dharr al-Ghifari successfully to Islam, he told him to keep his conversion a secret. He said, don't tell anybody. Go home. Back to Bani al-Ghifar. Go back to your village. And when you hear that we have victory, then come join us. Abu Dharr, he said, no way. I'm not keeping this thing a secret. So you know what he does? He goes right outside in the sanctuary, right outside in front of the Quraysh, and he starts to call them. He says, oh Quraysh, ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah.